In Fire Emblem Fate's Birthright, Hayato is pretty bad. He joins as an underleveled trainee mage and is rendered largely irrelevant as a 1-2 range squishy unit when everyone else turns into 1-2 ranged ninjas and just shred through foes. There are some relevant paths you can take him. No one in Birthright is unsalvageable, and his Heartseal talent of Honi is particularly valuable, but from my understanding, he is still considered to be on the lower end of the cast, as the investment required simply isn't worth the payoff you get. That isn't the case in Revelation, however. Hayato is pretty regularly considered to be amongst the best units in the Rev cast. And in part, this is because he joins earlier and at a higher level. But that's only the beginning of Hayato's story, as it just so happens a ton of different aspects of Revelation happen to be structured in a way that are incredibly beneficial to the Wind Tribe's mage prodigy. So, buckle up gamers, because it's time to dive into a long overdue video about one of the franchise's most powerful mages. But before we begin, this video is part of an ongoing series where I'm doing a deep dive into every unit in the Revelation cast. If you're interested in looking at some of the previous units I've covered, they are in a playlist linked below, and if you'd like to vote on who gets covered next, consider supporting me on Patreon, where $5 and above backers have the ability to vote on not only reviews, but other stuff affecting the channel. With that being said, let's dive into today's unit, Rev U. Right off the bat, Hayato's base stats are basically what you expect from an early game mage. With 9 magic and 13 speed, he's frequently doubling enemies and deals pretty good chip damage. His magic alone probably isn't enough to kill even when doubling, but thankfully, Hayato's magic power doesn't just use his raw stat, as by starting in Diviner, he has the Magic +2 skill at base, so realistically his magic value is going to be 11, not 9. On top of that, Hayato's personal skill Pride, shout out to Pride Month, gives him a +4 damage modifier if he's attacking a higher level enemy. And when this is active, his magic stat is functionally 15. And 15-13 offenses are really good. Unfortunately, making use of Pride is easier said than done. Hayato starts out at level 9, and the first main story chapter he's available in, Chapter 10, has no enemies aside from the boss that Pride is active against. That being said, Chapter 10 does also feature a deploy cut, so a reasonable action could be to bench Hayato in Chapter 10 and field him for the first time in Chapter 11, which has many more deployment slots. And if you do that, there's quite a few enemies that trigger Pride. Many of the Samurai, Oni, and Spear Fighters start out at level 10, and the map also features some promoted Master Ninja, and promoted units are counted as 20 plus their level, so any promoted units will always trigger Pride for Hayato. The Master Ninjas are probably a bad example when it comes to this though, as they are really poor matchups for any mage, since they sport high resistance and wield daggers, which have triangle effectiveness over tomes. Instead, I think the ideal prey for a Pride Hayato are the Berserkers in Chapter 12, as these are low resistance units who have weapon triangle disadvantage against tomes. And of course, a similar thing is true for any of the Oni Chieftain or Generals that Rev's mid and late game likes to throw at you. My point is that promoted enemies are a pretty frequent occurrence in Revelation, so it's not all that uncommon for an unpromoted or even a low-level promoted Hayato to have plenty of prey for his Pride ability. Beyond speed and magic, Hayato's other stats are also quite good. Skill of 9 and luck of 11 ensure that with Hayato's accurate tomes, he's not going to have too many hit issues. And while Hayato's bulk isn't exactly the best out there, 5 defense at a 40% growth and 7 resistance at a 30% growth are better than you would expect from a frail magic user, especially in conjunction with his High for Fate's 50% HP growth. Albeit this growth supplements a pretty meager HP base of 22. But on the topic of Hayato's growths, all of his growths are also quite good. 55% magic and 60% speed are the most important ones, ensuring that he will continue to double and chunk enemies for a good amount, but 40% in skill and 65% in luck also keep up his accuracy. 40% defense and 30% resistance are also not phenomenal, but much better than you would expect on a mage. And this is relevant enough as the late game of Rev features a lot of enemies with 1-2 range. So unfortunately, the prideful Wind Mage won't be able to avoid counterattacks forever. But thankfully, his bulk is usually enough to take one hit from all but the buffest enemies. So far, I'm sure some of you are wondering why I said that Hayato is generally considered to be one of the best units in Rev, when his stat spread, even with his phenomenal ability taken into account, is that of your average mage. Maybe slightly better than someone like Merrick, Lute, or Lu, but still very much in the ballpark of what you expect from the early game mage. But to really understand why being a slightly above average mage is such a phenomenal thing in Rev, I think we need to take a look at Hayato's competition. I've already done a video on Orochi, the other early joining diviner, but she joins a chapter after Hayato at a lower level with worse bases and generally worse growths. She has very good magic and skill growth, granted, and can become a pretty decent DVAS user if you want that, but her speed and bulk are abysmal, so she often finds herself one-shot by even relatively weak enemies, and she's never going to double anyone. In fact, she's the one getting doubled most of the time. After Orochi, your next magic user is Nyx, who is a laughably underpowered dark mage. And in fact, the dark mages in general come so late that they aren't really viable options for your team, at least in the early and mid game. Leo is definitely the best of the dark magic trio, and I actually think he's quite good in Rev, but that's a topic for another time. The main point I want to get across is if you want a mage in the early game, or just to train up a mage for the late game, Hayato is one of your only viable options. The other go-to magical units are Sakura, Felicia, and a magical Corrin, and all of these can be good. In fact, I would call all three of them pretty phenomenal units. But they also take more investment than Hayato to get online. In order to use tomes, Felicia and Corrin both need a heart seal, and Sakura needs to promote. Not only that, but all three of these goobers will be stuck at E rank, which is pretty unfortunate in the context of a Fate's Tome user. Because one of the main appeals to getting a mage on your team is being able to make use of all of Rev's super broken spell tomes. Since Rev has access to both the Norian and Hoshiden armories, you can use any of the powerful tools. On the Hoshiden side of things, the two most noteworthy are Horse Spirit and Calamity Gate. Horse Spirit is just a generically powerful spell at D tier that happens to buff 4 very relevant stats. It gives +3 to your skill, speed, defense, and resistance, meaning that even with Hayato's not phenomenal bulk, it can allow him to tank enemies that he otherwise shouldn't. The speed also helps with the doubling thresholds against faster enemies. Although the fastest enemies, Master Ninjas, are going to be dispatched more readily by the Calamity Gate, as that inverts the weapon triangle while also buffing your speed. The buffs aren't as significant as those from Horse Spirit, it's only +1 speed and +1 defense, but I think reaving against daggers is certainly valuable, as reversing and doubling the weapon triangle means you might actually dodge knives while landing a hit on the super dodgy Master Ninjas. On the Norian side of things, you also get some wonderful tools to play with. At C rank is Lightning, which is Fate's lowest ranked Brave weapon. It's only 1 might, and it debuffs you every time you use it, which stacks up over time, but it can be nice as an emergency delete button, especially since Hayato tends to have a pretty good magic stat, which makes up for the tome's lower might. On the other end of things is Nosferatu, which is a much more defensively oriented tome. It can't double or land critical hits, but you heal up half of the damage dealt. The main downside is this can only be used by the Dark Mage class. Although Hayato does have access to the Dark Mage line, and Sorcerer is not a bad endpoint for him. Still, I'm not a huge fan of Nosferatu when it comes to Revelation. I simply think that the enemies are too tough to effectively Nos tank, and I consider it to be a waste of money, but I wanted to mention it as it is a noteworthy tome in the other routes, and on the lower difficulties, I'm sure there's some stuff you could do with a Nosferatu Hayato. Heck, even on Lunatic, there's some niche situations where the lifesteal can be useful, but personally, I think there's far better things to spend your gold on than Nos. Talking about Nosferatu does, however, give us an excuse to go over Hayato's class options. He starts out as a Diviner, which is the Hoshiden Mage equivalent, and for the most part, he usually wants to stay in this class. Upon promotion, he gets two options, which each provide their own benefits. Omnioji is typically considered the weaker class from a combat perspective, although it has staff access if you want some extra healing utility, and more importantly, it teaches two very useful skills, Rally Magic and Tome Fair. Rally Magic is not really useful on Hayato, as I think of him as a primary combat unit, so he's typically the one getting rallied, not the one doing the rallying. Tome Fair, on the other hand, is absolutely invaluable, as it gives Hayato a +5 damage boost when using tomes, and as a mage, tomes are going to be his primary weapon of choice. Basara, on the other hand, is entirely combat-oriented. It gets lances instead of staves, so there's no utility to be had here. Its trade-off with Omnioji is also pretty straightforward. It gives 2 less points of magic in exchange for a pretty significant upgrade in both bulk and accuracy, as HP, defense, skill, and luck are all improved in Basara as compared to Omnioji. Basara itself also has some fairly desirable skills. Rend Heaven isn't something that I typically like, as I'm not a fan of proc skills, but if you want the chance at getting a little bit of extra damage, it is at least fairly likely to activate, although it's worth noting that its damage boost is based on the enemy's strength or magic, so in Hayato's case, it's not going to be doing much extra damage, if any, as when facing purely physical enemies, it's going to be drawing from the 0 magic stat of those foes. Still, if Hayato finds himself fighting against other hybrid foes, such as Oni Chieftains, this can be a useful if unreliable proc skill. And it's not as unreliable as some others since it has the highest activation chance of any skill in the game. And you can bolster it even further with the Basara's level 15 skill, Quixotic, which boosts the hit rate and proc chance of both you and your opponents. Although the only enemy with any proc skills in Revelation is Iago, so it's typically just a one-sided boost when it comes to proc rates. Personally, like I said, I don't use proc skills, so I appreciate the accuracy bolster from Quixotic much more than the proc skill boost. But even without any chance-based skills on Hayato, the accuracy boost is appreciated, especially if he's using one of the less accurate tomes, such as Lightning. Basara does also have one other, less obvious advantage over Omnioji, and that is the +7 strength and innate access to lances, allowing Hayato to kind of adopt the role of a hybrid attacker. He's still usually going to be dealing more damage with tomes than he is with any physical weapon, but being able to hit on defense against other magic users is surprisingly useful, especially since Hayato doesn't have the worst strength in the world. It's not his specialty, his base is only 2, and a 35% growth in Diviner isn't phenomenal, but I've seen worse strength growths. Believe me, the lance access does actually come up occasionally. And beyond just using physical lances, if Hayato raises his lance rank enough, especially with the help of an arm scroll, he can get access to the Bolt Naginata. And at 11 might, that's not a terrible weapon to wield, especially when you factor in the defense and resistance boost. Sure, it's less of a stat boost than Horse Spirit gives, but it's a higher might weapon by a significant margin, and against the really bulky late game enemies of Rev, sometimes those points can make a difference. Of course, the Bolt Naginata isn't just useful for Basara Hayato, as it allows him to take his magic stat into more physically oriented classes. And particularly noteworthy is the Great Master class, which you can acquire through either Sakura Marriage or Azama Friendship. This can be nice if you want Hayato to lean into the bulky mage role, as while Great Master itself has similar bulk levels to Basara, the Renewal skill, which it gets at level 5, can help to supplement the long-term survivability of Hayato, as it causes him to recover 20% of his HP per turn. And this can be combined with one of Hayato's other class options to make a non-traditional, silly, off-meta build. Specifically, by getting Monk from Sakura Marriage and Knight from Benny Friendship, Hayato can be the legendary Armored Mage. General is the bulkiest class Hayato has access to, and an A support Benny will give him an extra 6 defense on top of that. So, with the Bolt Naginata in tow, Hayato's not actually terrible in the bulky mage role. And alternatively, if you want your mages to use actual magic, Oni Chieftain is the Hoshiden equivalent of General, and it gets access to tomes, so you can equip the Horse Spirit for an even bigger defense boost than the Bolt Naginata gives. I should caution that even if you're going for General Hayato as your long-term build, I wouldn't recommend an early reclass to Oni, unless you are really committing to the meme. That's because, as a level 9 Oni Savage, Hayato doesn't really fulfill the tanking role. His stats are comparable to the other two tanks, Tsubaki and Rinka, at their base levels of 5 and 4 respectively. But he's both a higher level and a later joiner, so he's going to struggle to get experience even more than the two of them do. It's not impossible to make work. I've done early Hayato Oni a couple of times, but it's definitely much more investment than payoff. Trust me, you'll be fine with just the growths in Diviner, even if you are going for a bulky mage as your end goal. However, as you might have guessed from a build that includes Miracle amongst its recommended skills, this isn't exactly Hayato's meta role, and I wouldn't recommend going in general outside of specifically the meme factor. Instead, if you want Hayato's best and most basic option, look towards his Nyx Marriage. You see, that gives access to Dark Mage, which is generally considered to be the best magical class in Fates. Not only does this give Malefic Aura and Heartseeker two phenomenal skills, but it also promotes into either Sorcerer, which allows Hayato to be a phenomenal damage dealer, or Dark Knight, which makes him more of a bulky mage, albeit less bulky than as an Oni or General, but generally a more productive member of the team than he would be in either of those classes. And it's probably pretty boring, but Sorcerer Hayato is kind of just the best thing you can do with him. Between Malefic Aura and Magic +2, he gets a default +4 boost to his magical damage. And if he's able to grab Tome Fair before eventually slotting into Sorcerer, he gets another +5 on top of that. And with Nyx Marriage, he can gain a total of 8 magic from a Nyx backpack. So Hayato kind of just throws nukes around casually as a sorcerer. And these damage stacks means he also deals pretty good damage as a Dark Knight, where he'll be bulkier and have more movement if you would prefer one of those attributes. And if you're going for a Dark Knight bulky Hayato, then his Fuga Friendship is also potentially relevant. It comes online very late as Fuga is a late joiner, but it gives him access to the Vantage skill, which is a nice bulk booster since it allows him to go first and potentially finish off weakened foes, or simply gain guard gauge before they can attack him. I don't think Hayato is min-maxed enough to be a Vantage sweeper, but that's okay. He has generally good stats and is in a very good class. I think he'll make do. And that's kind of what Hayato's secret sauce is. In a game where tomes are really good, he's basically the only early game mage with acceptable stats. His growths manage to simultaneously be well-rounded while also not underwhelming, a rarity amongst any Fire Emblem character. And his base stats are usually good enough even before the damage stacks that he has pretty easy access to. Although, I'm not being entirely honest when I say Hayato is the only early game mage with access to good stats, because there is one other potential candidate for a strong early game mage in Rev. But fortunately for Hayato, he's actually necessary for her to exist, because that mage is none other than his daughter Rajat. In comparison to her father, Rajat is much more min-maxed. She has a heavy focus on speed and magic, and treats almost everything else as a dump stat. Although, I think her HP is at least passable, and in conjunction with really good resistance, she can pretty effectively fight against enemy tome users. When it comes to physical foes, however, she's a bit of a glass cannon. But hey, a glass cannon mage isn't a terrible place to be in Rev's early game. And it is indeed possible to get Rajat relatively early for a Gen 2 unit. Her first two potential mother candidates are Felicia and Sakura. Sakura offers generally good stats, and Felicia, while giving worse stats, does at least have the advantage of offering a level 15 promoted skill. And my personal favorite thing to slap on Rajat early is Quixotic, since with her low skill and skill growth, she can sometimes face accuracy issues, and this helps to patch them up. Of course, if you're willing to be a bit more patient, Orochi and Nyx are also very good candidates for Rajat's mother, since they both help to emphasize her really high magic in order to further fit into the glass cannon role. Orochi Mom hurts her speed a little bit, but in my opinion, she still turns out plenty fast enough, and she has a bonkers magic stat to go on top of it. Meanwhile, Nyx can make her skill issue a little bit worse, although if you're willing to do a high investment Nyx build, she can also pass down the solution to it in Certain Blow from Mozu Friendship or Lucky 7 from Outlaw. And no matter who her mother is, Rajat always gets access to both Wyvern Rider from Percy and Dark Mage from Ophelia, so you can go into Malignite or Sorcerer if you so desire. Although, it's worth noting that without any grinding maps, getting 2nd gen supports is relatively slow, so these are both going to be somewhat endgame appropriate options for Rajat, rather than a fully fledged part of her mid-game build. Instead, the main thing Rajat does is the same thing as her father. She functions as a very good mage, in a game where good mages are scarce. She even has a personal skill that helps to boost her damage similar to Hayato's Pride. Although ironically, despite being canonically bisexual, her skill isn't also named Pride. Instead, she has Vendetta, which gives her a +4 damage boost against someone she has previously battled. This condition is easier to fulfill than Pride's, although I'd argue it's still less useful since you have to have already attacked an enemy, and the number of foes a glass cannon like Rajat isn't too rounding is going to fit on one hand. So oftentimes Vendetta feels like overkill more than anything. Still, against the bulkiest enemies, it is nice to get that damage stack, especially since, without specific pairings, it can be difficult to get as many damage boosting skills on Rajat as it is on Hayato, although admittedly, she needs them less than her Pops does. But that's really all I have to say about Rajat, and by extension, that's kind of the end of what I have to say about Hayato. He's really good, but for really straightforward reasons. Tomes are strong, and you don't get that many strong tome users. Because of this, I put both Hayato and Rajat in the A tier, although Hayato I have near the top and Rajat near the bottom, mostly because Hayato has more availability and Rajat has less. Ultimately, I think they're both good for very similar reasons. Mages are powerful in Fates, as it turns out. Odin, Nyx, and Orochi just kind of give them a bad name. In fact, mages are so good that I can see a decent argument for putting Hayato in S tier. And maybe he will move as the tier list shakes out, but for now I have him in high A, mostly because I can't really justify putting him on the same level as Corrin, Camilla, and Reyna. Some of the best pre-promotes that you get, and the avatar with all avatar favoritism. Plus, if we're being honest, everyone knows Azura is going to end up in S tier, and I don't want to risk the tier list being too top heavy, especially since I still find Jacob to be more useful than Hayato is, just because of his early game contributions. But I'm curious what y'all think. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are on Hayato, and by extension his daughter, as well as which of Fates' broken tomes you like using on them best. Because, let's be honest, choosing what tome to use is the closest thing these two have to build variety. Thank you to my patrons, which includes Logs, Glup Shido, Erica Ford, Perg Knight, YL01, George Grenville the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Floahay, Amy Hazel, Hungry Heart, Hound Dogs, Burnt to Cinders, Crimson Claw, Fork King, Sarah, Ziggy WSB, Derek, Shinthia, Faulty Videos, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Anna Cabana, The Daily Fugle, Faye, Magic Bite, Thoughtful Insanity, Robin Goodfeller, JT Spritter, Laura Hunter, Jonathan Durbin, Dysike, Chris, Root Bear Pants, Queen Elizam, Control Tejas, Roman Kromancic, Knick Knack Hammersmack, Carrier has left, Angel Nop Caceres, Zanwith, Not Gino, Name Number 5, Squid Stats, Big Fan of Bishop Clement, Derek, Flingon, Edward C., Cabbage, Caius Cole, Bree, Punchfighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Sardonic Muse, Wesley Toma, Sensitive Luigi, Rage, Dr. Frying Pan, Toon, Tercy P., Fental Illness, Wannabe Cinnabon, Punk Tattoo Guy, Key the Iron Idol, Jax McMahon, Saren Gurlixy, Rezi, Dino Anna, Alex Erie, Andu, Rhea, Gameboo, Karosa, Firant, Your Doctor, Frozen Helm, KH, Girl Boss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Jaden, Dylan Solis, Some Trades, Alice, Smaz Ruby, Robin D, Alenby, They Thom, Clan, Pillow Willow, Gabe the Green, Guiji555, and especially my Jagans, Hime Rowan, Siggy, Dragonback Lancer, Autumn, and Maritas Bacon. If you're still watching at this point, I would love if you consider donating to my Patreon. You'll get your names up here, you get access to videos early, you get access to polls, there's all sorts of benefits. But please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. Regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.